All right, guys. So we're going to review several topics that we've done in Computer Programming 1. So mainly the focus of this review is going to be about variables, um, defining them, how we kind of organize them. Uh, so we have global and local, so we need to talk about that. And then how we have used simple objects to better organize our variables. Okay. All right. So what you guys have learned up to this point has been that if we want to define a variable, we use the let keyword. So I can call this, let's call this global variable, glovar1. Okay. Now a global variable, I can declare it, where that means I'm saving a memory space for that variable outside of any function, method, anything. It means that I can globally touch it. That means I can, in the setup, I can access that variable, put something, store something in there, and then use that. So I can initialize it with a value anywhere, and I can use that anywhere. Okay, so I could say text global var1, and let's put it in the middle of the screen. Okay, now we've also, in the draw function, I could do it this way too, and that gets called 60 times a second. So I could do frame count so we can see that too. This is global, okay? So there it's going, continually getting called over and over and over and over and over, okay? I can, after I use that value, I can change it. For one, I can say hello world. Okay, so there's a couple things that we see that this is kind of letting us know about. The draw, that happens continually. So question might be, well, why don't I see this text that I'm displaying on the screen? Well, that's because in the draw, we are replacing everything. We are redrawing a background that got drawn over it, and the word hello world is drawn over it because it's no longer there, or the world. So if I take off the background, I now see it, it's in black, and I'm seeing the frame count, okay? So this is getting continually called. Now this is a global variable, okay? Now, if I take this variable, and let's move it. So I move it outside, from outside to inside a function. So this is inside of this setup function. This makes it a local variable. That means I'm locally defining the variable to exist inside of this right here. So yes, let global var1, and why don't we switch this? We're going to switch this here to here. And then we want this, the text one, since it's going to be part of the screen. Let's do that. Okay. So here, this is a local variable. It's locally defined, locally declared inside of a function. It doesn't matter what function. If we're using loops, conditionals, arrays, any of that stuff, even in a simple object, if we are defining it as locally scoped, that means that I can't access it out of anywhere else. So if I try to access this, it will error out. Okay, so we have the hello world, but this right here, what I'm trying to print, this is not the same variable as this. This is locally scoped. Okay, so it's two different things. Now, if I say let global var, and this is where it's a little bit harder to understand the concept because this JavaScript is trying to help us out so much. But if I globally declare the variable and I locally declare that same variable, we're going to see that there's two different things. Okay, this is not the same as this one. Here it's giving me hello, and it's giving me the frame count. It's letting me know that we haven't even started calling. Here I'm changing it. Now, if I there are ways that we can get it where it's going to actually error out. So let's do that. Okay, so this one in here, let's now if we were doing a different language, it's a lot easier. But JavaScript, it wants to try to help when we have bad coding practices. So this is a local variable, okay? I can give it a value, so I could say 63, and I can print this out, console.log local variable. Now, there shouldn't be an issue with this running. This is still technically good, okay, because this is running inside of that draw. That draw is getting continually called. This is a local variable. A lot of times when I'm using a local variable, it's something that I don't really need to hold on to, so I can create it and be done with it when I'm done. If I do something like this, and I try calling that local var 29, let's see what we get. Okay, we're still getting this 63 because this is what's holding it right here. This is locally scoped. If I do they're not the same thing. They're not the same variable, and this is where we can have a lot of problems. Even though I wrote it exactly the same, this one is globally scoped. I globally wrote that. Okay, here is locally scoped. So if I am this one that's being used, and this is JavaScript trying to deal with it, it's using that locally scoped one. If I did local var equals 112, okay, I am trying to redefine a variable that is globally scoped, but I have it locally scoped as well. So in here, it's treating it like that doesn't make sense because it's saying that I'm trying to change a value that I haven't declared yet. Okay, so that's the difference between global and local. If we want it to exist only inside of a function, then we put it in between any code block and it will exist only there. Okay, if we want to be able to touch it globally, that means anywhere, then we got to define it globally. Okay, so I can't do a local var like this. I want to do it inside of a function. Okay, so this would be a global like this. Okay, now there are actually a couple different ways that we can define a variable, and up to now we've always learned about let because that's the only one that I really told you, and we've learned about camel casing. Camel casing is where the second letter, every subsequent first letter of every word, the beginning of every word outside of the first one always has a capital letter so that we can see it because we can't write variables with spaces. Okay, so this is camel casing. Okay, means that if I had a third word that I am going to use, okay, each word that I'm going to start will be capitalized. That is camel casing. Okay, now variables that we don't want to change, there's actually a different way that we would write them. We wouldn't write let. Let means that I'm going to have a variable that's going to change. A variable that I don't want to change is a const, standing for constant. So when I use these, so let's call it a constant var. Okay, I have a name for it. Now, this is going to perform different because as soon as I use this const keyword to define this variable, to declare it, it wants to be initialized immediately. I can't initialize it later. Okay, so I can say hello. Okay, now if I want to display it, I can display it just fine. Okay, the difference is that if I want to change it, it will not let me. So I can say, I want to change this to hello world. Look, it's giving me an error already. Attempting to override constant variable, which is a constant. It doesn't want to do it. So I'm going to arrow this out, and this JavaScript will actually display assignment to constant variable. It doesn't want me to do it. So line 9 is where my error is, because I'm trying to override something that I have basically declared as being a constant. Now, there are some things that we want to be constant, certain things in our game that we are going to define that we never want to change, certain things that we want to always be the same. Like, how about the value of pi? Okay, which is off the top of my head, I think it's 3.14529 something or other. Let's see, values of pi. Values of pi. 3.141596. Okay. 15926. Okay, so this is an unchanging thing. Okay, so using pi in this way, making it a constant, is a good thing. If I wanted the size of my characters in my game, I may not want them to change sizes, or I may not want my gravity to change in my game. There may be some things that I have to define as a constant because I don't want even my own code to mess it up. Okay, that's when I would use const. This it can be really useful. Now, how would you know that you declared something as constant, as a constant variable in your code? Because if we're looking at everything in camel case, I doubt that we're going to end up writing anything with constant in the front. Actually, what we do to recognize when we are writing something as a constant, we always write it all in caps. And this is just a recognized way for us to be able to see it. So when we're looking for pi, or we're looking for, let's call it player height, it's all in caps. Okay, that's how we can easily recognize it anywhere in our code. That I can, console log the player height, and I know that that is never going to change because I'm seeing it as a constant. Okay, this is how we would use a constant variable. There are a lot of times that this is very, very useful. I never talked about it before because we didn't really need that complexity. So we have global and local variables. We have variables that are allowed to change and variables that have to stay constant. Now, we also learned about creating simple objects. Simple objects, we have learned, is a way that we can kind of encapsulate our variables into one thing. A simple object can be initially declared as a global or a local variable, and then I can define it with what we would call as attributes. And attributes, really all it is it's just variables used for just this object. Okay, so I could have it have an x, and that could be related to its position. So I could say maybe width divided by 2. I separate each attribute with a comma. I could have a Y for my vertical part of my position. I could have a color that could be anything I wanted. 58 and 233. I could have even a function that I want to actually be an attribute of an object. So I could have a display function, okay, which I can write and then fill my code. So I could say fill with this dot color, okay. I can say that I want to display a rectangle at this dot x, this dot y, and have if I have a size, or I can manually say it. Okay. Now, when I create it, it's not going to do anything, but this, in terms of organization, makes things much simpler, because instead of me having 1, 2, 3 pieces of variables, I have one. That one is holding it. So I could access, let's bring that background back. I can access that simple object and can call any one of their attributes. In this case, I could call the display function and display the object. I can also call its individual, say, x display, see, simple object.x, and I could add values to it, and then we can do stuff. Now, normally, if we're going to mess around with a simple object, we actually want to have all of its code kind of encased inside of the object itself. That way, we can let the object that we're creating worry about itself, how it displays, how it moves, how it interacts. And this makes our coding a lot easier and more organized, because instead of me having to try to remember a little, what is that X and why am I doing it here, I can do it here and say, okay, well, I want to update my simple object. Well, what do I want to do with it? Well, I want to have it move a random position on the screen. So let's say I create random value. This is locally scoped for this attribute, this update attribute. And I want it to be some random number from 0 plus that size. So let's do, half that size. We'll do 50 to all the way to the maximum width of the screen minus that 50. Okay, so I want to take that random value, and this dot x will be that random value. Okay, now when I run, again, it's not going to do anything unless I call those things, but I have this display that's just responsible for displaying that shape, my simple object on the screen. But now I can have another basically attribute function for the simple object that is just responsible for updating anything that I needed it to update. In this case, I wanted it to update the position of that x, and so it's just taking that random value. Maybe I didn't want it to do that much. Maybe I want it to do this dot x minus 5 and this dot x plus 5. So I kind of have it like wiggle. Okay, there, I got that. I don't have to mess around with the display function anymore. I can just play around with this update function just to make my shape move. I can, maybe have a special function that I want for if I'm hovering over it, that I can do something specific with it. All of this is really just us using variables in different ways. What we can put in variables can be many different things. Variables can hold text. We've seen that. It can hold numbers. It can hold fractions, decimals. fractions you'd have to convert to decimals. Decimals, and it can hold Boolean. Now, Boolean is just a true or false, okay? Boolean is only one of two things. It's either true or false, okay? True or false. So maybe I want to display a I want it to not display a color unless I, am clicking the mouse or something. So let's build our simple object. We'll add something new to it. Let's create a variable that we call show, and let's show color, and we want it to start out as false. Okay, and then inside my display, I'm going to say if. This is using a conditional. Conditionals, the different parts of it, it's going to be either true or false, but it has to be a like Boolean value. So I could say if this dot show color. So if that's true, then what do I want to do? I want to show this color. If it's not, what do I want to do? I'm just going to display this shape. So if it is true, I want to show the color on the shape. If it's not, I don't want to put any color. Okay, so let's go ahead and run. I have no color. Okay, so I can combine this with different things. Maybe something that's event based, and I could maybe create like a mouse pressed function that we know is event based. We've seen that in the references. We can look at the references and look at all the different events, okay? So there's lots of stuff that we can do. We're going to do mouse press. That's a good one to use and to play with that one, okay? So any one of these are not always happening. They are event based. So if I'm doing that thing and it's firing, then it's going to do it. So in this case, I could say if mouse is pressed, I could check if I'm actually clicking on the object itself. In this case, I'm not making it that complex. I'm going to say simple object dot show color is the opposite of what it was. Now, I'm going to show you a better way to write this. But if we run this, so this would be kind of like rapid prototyping. I just want to make sure that it's working. So now when I'm clicking the mouse, I'm getting it to switch. But it's not switching after I switched it once. Okay. But it did do it that initial time. So once we clicked it, it did it. Okay. So the idea then, once we have that color, we need to make it so that it is, once it switches to true, that this color that it's choosing to fill, watch this. So we want it to fill with just white. So let's just put white. Okay. So now it's flipping back and forth. If show color is true, that means I clicked on it, it's going to fire it. Now, having this where I'm changing variables outside of the function, that's actually not very good. So maybe we might create a new attribute function that we call maybe update color. And it's going to be a function. And all it's going to do is change the color. So basically, I'm just doing this. If it was, so it's something like this inside of here, but I need to rewrite it because this is actually not a good way to write. So we want to comment that out, but that's basically what I want to write. So this dot show color is going to be equal to the opposite of this dot show color. So we're just having it flick like a switch on and off. And then if we're pressing this mouse, then it's me calling that function, simple object dot update color, update color. Okay, Now we can call that, and now it still has that same functionality, but this makes it so that I don't have to worry about what is separately happening outside of the object. It's all happening inside of the object. I even have this simple little switch. Now I could do this a little bit differently. Instead of me just calling this empty function with no parameters, maybe instead of calling this where it's a switch where it's going on and off, I can pass in a color. So let's do that. Let's do let random. So I'm doing locally defined random R. Let's just actually I'm just going to do R. R is going to be a random value from 0 to 255. I'm going to repeat this again 3 times. R, G, and B. So this one will be G and B. Okay. Now, my update color, what do I want to do? I want to update with the values of R, G, and B. Now, we never really did this in Computer Programming 1, but I can pass values into functions. I can also pull values from functions, have them do some type of calculation for me. So instead of me doing a switch, let's change this to change the color. So this dot color, let's just actually rewrite this a little bit. This dot color is color of R, G, and B. But how do we actually get those values into from here into here? Well, that's where what I got to define in the parentheses. If I am pulling these values, okay, and I'm creating this function for this update color, I have to define what those parameters that are going inside this function is. So I'm saying that first one is going to hold the red, the second one is going to hold the green, third one's going to hold the blue. Okay, so then if I'm updating here, I don't really need this anymore, but I can do fill this dot color. Okay, so I'm not really using the show color anymore. Now each time I'm pressing the mouse, I get a different random color. Okay, now I want to kind of show something. So let's say this red, I want that always to be 255. My green, I always want to be 255. Okay, if I put these values in a different position, okay, so we see red, green, and blue. I'm passing in what I'm wanting for my red, my green, and my blue in that order, and I'm defining my function with my red, my green, and my blue being my first one, okay? But these variables right here, these are locally scoped to this function. It only exists here. So I can call it, let's call it red, green, and blue. I can't call them anywhere else, but that's what exists right here. Okay, now if I am passing information in the wrong order, that's what I want you guys to see. So let's say blue, R, and G. Okay, now if I'm passing this, I'm getting kind of weirder colors. They're all kind of hints of blue. Let's do that as 0, and let's do this as 0. We got blue's the only one that's doing a random. Okay, so now what we're seeing is we're seeing a whole bunch of red. Well, why? I defined this to be like my blue, but I put that in as the first one. What happened when I'm building my colors? Well, that first thing that I passed in got defined as this local variable for this function as red, and then it's being built in the color function as red. So that's all in the reference, but because I switched my order, it's actually messing up stuff. So instead of it giving me hints of blue, it's giving me all hints of red. So if I switch this up and I had red and then blue like this, let's see what happens now. We're going to get all different shades of green. because the blue, this variable right here, even though it's locally defined, is the only one that is giving me a random value that's switching, and I put that in as my middle one that I'm passing in to that update color function. So it's taking it as the middle one. It's not separating it out. It doesn't know what I'm putting in. It doesn't really care. Okay, so I have to pay attention to how I'm putting it in. If my blue is the only one that's changing, I need to make sure that it is put in the right order. Okay, so here. And then we get variations of blue. Now, if I wrote my variables wrong, like I wrote little g instead of big G, not the same variable. So I'm getting errors because G is not defined. All right. Now, if I pass it in correctly, so I'm passing in those values, R, G, and B, but then I am trying to pull it out like this, I will get errors too because G is not defined inside this function. Okay. Green is defined in the function. So I got to use that. I could do a console log to see what these values are, but these are the values that were passed in when I called that function. I called that function when the mouse was pressed, and I have to pass in the values, and then I have to use them correctly as how I defined them when I define the function. Okay, so this is a review over the difference between global and local variables. This is a review of the different things that we can put inside of variables, using simple objects to help organize our code, and what we introduce as a little bit more in depth on variables, being able to create constants that are on changing variables and will be prevented from us changing them in our code. And we learned different ways that we could play around with our objects, making sure that we are organizing our code in a much better way by encasing any variables that are specific only to that object to be inside of that object, which we would just call attributes, even the functions themselves. We will end up morphing this later into an actual class structure for object-oriented programming, but understanding this concept does help us be able to rapidly prototype to get our ideas across. Okay, so good luck, have fun.